The hail came through on a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of June, and it came fast the way those early summer storms did in that part of the county. A green sky for 20 minutes, and then stones the size of marbles, hammering the roof of the equipment shed for 6 minutes straight. Walter Boone was 71 years old and had farmed the same 140 acres outside Danville since he was 19, and he did not go out and look at the wheat until the storm had passed, and the sun had come back out like nothing had happened. He walked out to the north field, the good field, the one with the deep loam soil that had never given him less than 60 bushels an acre in a decade, and he stood at the edge of it with his cap in his hand. The wheat had been 3 weeks from harvest. It had been standing tall and gold, and even the kind of stand a man photographed for the county extension newsletter. Now it was flattened in sheets, laid over in the direction the wind had pushed it, the heads shattered and stripped where the stones had hit them dead on. He walked 20 yards into the field and bent down and picked up a head of wheat and rubbed it between his palms. There was almost nothing left in it. The kernels that hadn't been knocked loose onto the ground were split and bruised. His grandson Cody was with him. Cody was 19 and had been driving the grain truck for 2 summers, and was thinking about whether farming was something he wanted to do with his life, or something he wanted to have done once and moved on from. He looked at the field for a long moment and then he looked at his grandfather. "That's done, isn't it?" Cody said. "That's done," Walter said. The insurance adjuster came out on Thursday. His name was Gary Sissom, and he had been adjusting crop claims in that county for 11 years and had seen hail take fields before, though not usually this clean a job on this much acreage. He walked the field with a clipboard, stopping every 40 paces to count heads and note the damage percentage. He did the math out loud more for his own benefit than for Walter's. "I'm going to put this at 92% loss," Gary said. "You'll get your indemnity payment, minus your deductible, and it'll take about 3 weeks to process once I file. You carried the standard coverage, so you're looking at somewhere around 11,000 on this field, could be a little more or less once it's finalized." "And the note," Walter said, "that's not something I can help you with, that's between you and the bank." Walter had a note at Farmers and Merchants Bank for equipment he'd bought 2 years before. A used combine to replace one that had finally given out after 26 years of service, and the note had an annual payment due the first week of July, 31 days out from the day the hail hit. The payment was $6,280. The insurance money, when it came, would come in 3 weeks at the earliest, which put it a week past the due date if everything went smoothly, and Gary Sissom's claims did not always go smoothly. There had been a backlog the year before that ran 9 weeks on some claims after a bad derecho took out corn across 4 counties. Walter did not say any of this to Gary. He thanked him for coming out and watched him drive off. And then he stood at the edge of the ruined field, the way he had stood at the edge of a great many fields in 52 years of farming, turning something over in his mind that was not yet a plan. The talk started at the co-op the following Monday, the way talk always started at the co-op. A man named Dale Furman, who ran cattle on the section next to Walter's ground, mentioned that the Boone place had taken a hard hit, and that Walter was probably looking at a rough month. Someone at the counter said hail was hail, you couldn't do anything about it but wait on the insurance. Dale said the trouble was the timing, that a man with a note due before the check came was going to be scrambling regardless of what the adjuster wrote down. A third man younger said he'd heard Walter was already out in the field doing something, though nobody seemed to know what. This last part was true, though nobody at the co-op understood yet what they were describing. Walter had in fact been out in the field every morning since the storm, walking it slowly with a 5-gallon bucket, and a notebook, which was not what a 71-year-old man does with a wrecked wheat crop, if he has already decided there is nothing left to do but wait for a check. He had spent 4 years in his 30s working part of every summer for his wife's cousin, who ran a small diversified operation in the Ozarks that raised meat goats on rough pasture and cut over timber ground. Land that wasn't good for row crops, but was thick with brush and briar and volunteer growth that the goats cleared as they grazed. Walter had learned there that browse ground and pasture ground were not the same thing, and that a field a man had given up on for one purpose could still be worth something for another. He had never had reason to use that knowledge on his own place, because his own place had never failed him the way that wheat field had just failed him. But he had kept it the way he kept most things he'd learned, filed away and mostly forgotten until it was needed. He was not a man who moved fast on ordinary days, and Ruth had told him more than once over the years that his slowness was not laziness, but a kind of patience that looked like laziness to people who had never farmed. He walked the fence lines first, the way he always did when he was trying to understand a piece of ground rather than simply look at it. He counted paces. He noted where the old fence sagged and where it was still tight. He noted the 2 gates, one on the county road side that a truck and trailer could back up to easily, and one on the creek side that had rusted half shut and would need attention if he was going to move anything through it. He walked the wheat field with the bucket, pulling up handfuls of the flattened stand and looking underneath it. Wheat straw, even shattered and stripped of grain, was still substantial forage, and beneath the fallen straw where the canopy had been knocked down. Sunlight was already reaching ground that had been shaded for 2 months, and volunteer clover and foxtail and other low growth were beginning to come up through the wreckage faster than he would have expected. He noted the fence lines. The field was bordered on 3 sides by good woven wire that had been up since his father's time and maintained since, and the 4th side along the creek had a single strand of old barbed wire that would need reinforcing. He noted the water. The creek ran along the west edge and held water even in a dry June, which meant he would not need to haul water to a temporary setup. He noted the shade. A stand of hackberry and locust ran along the fence line on the north side, enough cover that animals would have relief from the July sun without him building anything. He wrote in the notebook that night, sitting at the kitchen table after his wife Ruth had gone to bed. Wheat gone, ground not gone, 31 days. The next morning he called the man he still knew from the Ozarks operation, a man named Prout who had kept raising goats for another 20 years after Walter had moved on, and asked him what it would cost to get a starter group of meat goats on short notice, and what kind of turnaround a man could expect selling them. Prout told him Boercross weaned kids were running anywhere from $60 to $110 a head, depending on weight and condition, and that if Walter wanted animals that were closer to market weight already he'd pay more per head, but be looking at a much shorter turnaround. Possibly sellable within a month if there was demand, which there usually was heading into the Muslim holiday seasons, and general ethnic markets in the cities that always wanted goat meat, and often couldn't get enough of it locally. Walter did the arithmetic on the back of an envelope while he had Prout still on the phone. He did not have 31 days to grow kids to market weight from scratch. He needed animals that were most of the way there already, animals he could finish on the wheat fields down straw and the flush of new growth coming up under it and move quickly. He sold 2 things that week. The first was a hay rake he had not used in 3 years, since he'd started buying his hay from a neighbor rather than putting it up himself, sold to a young farmer starting out over in the next township for $1,150. The second was 40 bushels of wheat seed he had held back in the bin from the year before, seed he no longer had a use for, sold to a seed dealer in town for $6. $10 a bushel, which came to $244. Total from those 2 sales, $1,394. He used $980 of that to buy 16 Boercross wethers from Prout, animals in the 60 to 70 pound range, already partway to market weight, delivered to the farm on a Saturday morning in a stock trailer. He spent $260 on fencing supplies, mostly wire and T-posts to reinforce the creek side of the field, and to cross-fence it into 2 paddocks so he could rotate the animals and keep them working fresh ground rather than trampling everything in one section. He spent $80 on a mineral feeder and loose mineral mix appropriate for goats, since he did not have one on hand from his own operation. He kept $74 back for incidentals. Dale Furman was the one who noticed first. He drove past the Boone place on his way to check his own cattle on Sunday and saw the stock trailer backed up to the north field gate, and 16 goats coming down the ramp into what had been, 3 weeks before, a wheat field. He mentioned it at the co-op on Monday. "Boone's running goats on his hailed-out wheat ground," Dale said. "That's so," said the man behind the counter. "I saw it myself, little brown and white ones coming right off the trailer into that field." Someone said that was a strange use of good wheat ground, even if the wheat was gone, because a man who'd farmed that field for 50 years surely wasn't going to want goats churning it up before the next planting. Someone else said goats would eat anything, including the fence, and Walter was going to spend more fixing fence than he'd ever make selling animals. A third man, who ran a small orchard on the other side of the township, said he'd heard of people using goats to clean up rough ground before, but never on ground that was supposed to be clean cropland to begin with. A fourth man, older than the rest, who had farmed alongside Walter's father decades earlier, said the Boone place had always been run sensibly, and he doubted the old man had lost his sense overnight, whatever it looked like from the road. This was on the whole an accurate summary of what was happening and how strange it looked from the road, and none of it was said with malice. Only the particular skepticism of men who had farmed the same crops on the same kind of ground their entire lives, and had never had reason to think about that ground any other way. Cody heard most of this secondhand from a friend who worked part-time at the co-op sweeping floors and running the register on Saturdays, and he came home irritated by it in a way Walter was not. He said people were laughing at them behind their backs. Walter told him people had been laughing at farmers behind their backs since the first man ever tried something his neighbors hadn't tried yet, and that the laughing generally stopped being interesting to anyone the moment a check cleared. Cody did not look convinced, but he kept showing up every morning to help with the fence and the feed anyway, which was its own kind of answer. The first week did not go smoothly. The goats got into the standing straw immediately and worked through it faster than Walter had expected, and by day 4 he could see that the north paddock, the smaller of the 2 sections he'd fenced, was already grazed down close enough that he needed to move them to the second paddock sooner than his rotation plan called for. He moved them on day 5. The reinforced creekside fence held for 3 days, And then a section came loose where a locust root had heaved the ground and pulled a T-post at an angle, and 4 goats got out and were found by Cody the next morning standing in the ditch along the county road, eating blackberry canes that had grown up wild there. It took Walter and Cody most of a morning to get them back in and the fence reset properly, this time with the post driven deeper and braced against the root. There was a health scare on day 8. One of the wethers went off its feed and stood apart from the others with its head low. And Walter, who had not kept goats himself in decades, called Prout in something close to a panic, describing the symptoms over the phone. Prout walked him through it and concluded it was most likely bloat, the animal having gorged too fast on the lush new clover growth coming up under the wheat straw, rich green feed after a diet that had been drier and coarser at the start. Prout told him to get the animal moving, to drench it with baking soda in water if he had to, and to pull the whole group off the richest section of clover for 2 days and let them settle on straw and mineral instead. Walter did this. The animal came around by the following evening. He lost no animals in the first 2 weeks, though he came closer than he wanted to admit to Ruth, who had watched the whole business unfold from the kitchen window with an expression he chose not to ask her about directly. There was a second, smaller trouble in that first stretch that Walter did not mention to anyone outside the house. 3 of the 16 wethers had come off the trailer thinner than Prout's description had led him to expect. Animals that had likely been shorted on feed somewhere along the chain of hands they passed through before reaching him, and it took the better part of a week of careful supplemental feeding separate from the rest of the group before they were putting on weight at a rate that matched the others. He kept those 3 penned closer to the barn at night rather than leaving them out with the main group, which meant an extra chore twice a day that he had not budgeted time for, but which he judged worth doing rather than risk losing ground on animals he had already paid for. He sat at the table on the evening of day 9 and ran the numbers the way he had learned to over 50 years of bad seasons and good ones both. Payment due $6,280. Animal purchase $980. Fencing and supplies $340. Feed and mineral supplement beyond what the field itself was providing an estimated $180 through the remainder of the month. Since the goats were getting most of their nutrition from the field, but he was topping them off with a small amount of purchased feed to keep them gaining weight steadily. Hay rake and seed sale already in hand, $1,394. Running total in hand against the note once he backed out what he'd already spent on the operation. $894 available, with $5,386 still needed in 22 remaining days, either from insurance, which would not arrive in time, or from the goats, which had not yet been sold. He called Prout again and asked him to make some calls to the buyers he knew, the same ethnic market buyers and live auction contacts that moved goats out of that part of the Ozarks regularly, to see what kind of price the 16 animals could bring and how fast. Prout called back 2 days later and said he had a buyer, a livestock dealer out of the city who supplied several halal and Caribbean markets, and who was actively looking for finished goats ahead of a religious holiday later that summer, and who was willing to pay a premium for animals in good condition delivered on time. The price quoted was $2.15 a pound live weight, which, if the animals reached an average of 90 pounds by the end of the month, which Walter believed was achievable given how well they were doing on the field, would put the 16 animals at roughly $3,096 total. That was not enough on its own. He was still going to be short, even counting everything he had, unless something changed. He drove into town on day 12 and stopped at a small grocery that catered to a growing population of families from Central America and the Middle East who had settled in the area over the previous decade to work at the poultry processing plant 2 counties over. He had never had reason to go into that store before in his life. He asked the owner, a man named Farid, whether he ever bought goat meat locally. And Farid said he mostly brought it in from a supplier 2 hours away because he could never find anyone closer who raised it, and that he would gladly buy locally if the quality and the price were fair, and that he could take a portion of an order himself in addition to whatever Walter sold to the larger dealer, if Walter could get animals processed at a facility that met the requirements Farid's customers expected. Walter did not know the requirements off the top of his head, but he wrote down what Farid told him and found a small processing facility 40 minutes away that handled that kind of work regularly and could fit him into their schedule with 2 weeks' notice. Farid also mentioned, almost as an aside while writing down the name of the processing facility, that a woman who ran a small food truck 2 towns over made a goat curry on weekends that sold out most Saturdays, and that she was always asking around for a more reliable local supplier than the one she currently used who was inconsistent about delivery. Walter drove out to find her the following afternoon. A woman named Priya who had started the truck 3 years earlier after leaving a kitchen job in the city, and she agreed on the spot to take a share of the processed meat as well at a price close to what Farid was paying, provided Walter could commit to a regular delivery day going forward. He told her he could commit to this one round for certain and would talk to her again afterward about anything beyond that, since he did not yet know whether he would be running goats on that field again at all. He came home from that trip and split his plan in the notebook. He would sell 10 of the 16 animals through Prout's dealer contact at the live weight rate and process the remaining 6 through the facility Farid had pointed him to. Selling the meat directly to Farid's store and to Priya's food truck and one smaller market Farid vouched for personally at a considerably higher per pound price than the live weight rate, since processed and packaged meat commanded more than live animals and cut out a layer of middlemen. It would take more of his time and some processing fees, but the math when he ran it came out well ahead of selling everything live. On day 13, Walter drove out to check the second paddock in the early evening and found that a dog had gotten into the field, not a stray but a neighbor's retriever that had slipped its chain and wandered 2 properties and had the goats bunched tight against the far fence in a state of considerable agitation before Walter managed to run it off with a shout and a thrown clod of dirt. No animals were hurt, though one of the smaller wethers had scraped a leg getting tangled in the temporary netting he'd used to divide the paddocks, a shallow cut that Walter cleaned and treated himself rather than call anyone out for. He mentioned it to the dog's owner the next morning mildly, and the man apologized and fixed his chain, and there was no more trouble from that quarter, though Walter kept a closer eye on the fence line after dark for the rest of the month out of simple caution. Day 15 brought 3 days of hard rain, more than the field needed, and the creek came up out of its banks by a foot, flooding the lowest section of the second paddock and pushing the goats up onto higher ground on their own, which they did without much trouble. Goats being sensible about water in a way cattle sometimes were not. The rain did knock down another section of the reinforced fence where the ground had softened around a post, and Walter spent the better part of a morning in the rain resetting it with Cody's help. Sinking the post deeper and packing gravel around the base this time so it would hold in wet ground. The delay cost him half a day he had planned to spend calling around about processing dates, but it did not cost him any animals. By day 18, the goats had been weighed by Prout's contact, who drove out with a portable scale, and the average was running ahead of what Walter had projected, close to 96 pounds ahead, rather than 90. Because the field had turned out to be richer forage than either of them had expected, the combination of downed wheat straw, flourishing clover, and the shade along the tree line keeping the animals comfortable and eating steadily even through several hot afternoons. Walter adjusted his numbers that night. 10 animals at 96 pounds averaged, sold live at $2. $15 a pound came to $2,064. That left 6 animals for processing. He booked the processing date for day 24, 4 days before the note was due, which gave him a narrow window to collect payment from Farid and the other 2 markets before driving into town to the bank. The processing itself cost him $28 a head, $168 total for the 6 animals, a cost he had not fully accounted for in his early numbers and which ate into the margin he'd expected from the higher retail price. He drove the 6 carcasses, already processed and packaged, to Farid's store on day 25. Farid took half of it himself and paid $4. $85 a pound on the packaged weight, which came to roughly $291 for his portion. Priya took a third for that Saturday's curry special and paid a similar rate, coming to $195, and the last small portion went to the market Farid had vouched for, coming to another $215. Ruth asked him on the evening of day 20, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had watched him do this kind of arithmetic through hard years, before, whether he had actually thought this would work when he brought those goats off the trailer, or whether he had just been doing something because doing nothing was worse. He told her he hadn't known for certain, only that a field that could still grow something was worth more than a field a man had already decided was finished, and that he had learned that lesson from a wrecked hay ground in Arkansas 30 years before he ever needed it on his own place. She did not say anything more, but she started keeping her own ledger of the sales that came through Farid's contacts. A small green notebook separate from Walter's field notes, tracking every check and every cash payment, as it came, in the way she had once tracked egg money and cream money in years before either of them had thought much about supplemental income at all. On day 27, Walter added up both notebooks. Live sale through Prout's dealer, 10 animals, $2,064. Processed meat sales through Farid and the 2 smaller markets, $701. Hay rake sale, $1,150. Seed sale, $244. Total gross income from the operation and the 2 early equipment sales, $4,159. Costs to subtract: animal purchase $980, fencing and supplies $340, supplemental feed $180, processing fees $168. Total costs, $1,668. Net available toward the note, $2,491, added to the $894 he had noted earlier as remaining after initial expenses, which put his running total, once he reconciled the overlapping figures carefully on a clean page so as not to double count anything, at $6,650. That was more than the $6,280 he owed, though not by a wide margin, and it had taken every animal he'd bought and both pieces of equipment he'd sold to get there. He drove into town on day 29, 2 days ahead of the due date, and set the deposit slips and receipts on the counter in front of the loan officer, a woman named Diane Kessler, who had handled the Boone account for 9 years, and had called him twice during the month to check on his plans, each time getting the same answer: that he was working on it and would have the payment by the due date. She looked through what he'd brought her: the dealer's payment record for the 10 live animals, the receipts from Farid's store and the 2 smaller markets, the deposit slips from the hay rake and seed sales weeks earlier. "This is all from that field that hailed out," Diane said. It was not quite a question. "That's what was left of it," Walter said. She counted it, confirmed the total, covered the payment with a little left over, processed it, and printed the receipt. She did not ask him for details about the goats, though she had clearly heard some version of the story already, the way everyone in a small county heard some version of everything eventually. She noted the account current and the next due date on the printed statement and slid it across the counter to him. The insurance check came 10 days later for $10,940 after the deductible. Exactly the kind of money Walter would have needed to lean on if the goats had not worked out, or if the fence had failed worse than it did, or if the bloat scare on day 8 had gone differently. It went into the operating account for the fall, for seed and fertilizer on the fields that hadn't hailed, and Walter did not count a dollar of it toward the note he had already paid. The remaining animals from the group, the ones he had not sold at the 20-day mark, because Prout's dealer had only wanted 10, and Farid's group had only wanted 6, that first round numbered 0, because Walter had in fact sold all 16 by day 25, having found once he started looking more demand for goat meat within 40 minutes of his own farm than he would have guessed existed a month before. He kept the fencing up on the north field into September, on the thought that he might run another short group of animals through there again if the opportunity arose before the ground needed to go back into wheat that fall. He did not in the end do that, because the wheat planting window came and the field needed to be worked and drilled, and a man does not run animals on ground he intends to plant in 3 weeks. But he left the reinforced fence corners in place along the creek, thinking he might use that field for something other than a straight row crop again someday if the need arose, or even if it didn't. Priya called in early August. Once her Saturday curry special had built up a regular following on the strength of the goat meat Walter had supplied her, and asked whether he would consider running another small group the following spring so the meat would be ready before her busiest season began. Walter told her he would think about it once he saw how the fall wheat planting went and what the rest of the year looked like financially, which was not a no, though it was not a firm yes either. She said she understood and would check back with him in the winter, and she did, calling again in December to ask the same question. By which point Walter had already decided he would likely run a smaller group the following June regardless of whether another storm ever came through that field again. Simply because the arithmetic of it had turned out better than he expected, and there was no particular reason to let a working arrangement go to waste. Cody, for his part, stopped talking about whether farming was something he wanted to do with his life sometime around day 20 of that month, though he did not announce any decision outright. He asked Walter, while they were resetting the creek fence for the last time before pulling it back for winter, whether Walter had been scared that first week, watching money go out the door on goats before any of it had come back in. Walter told him that being scared and doing the arithmetic anyway were not opposites, that a man who waited until he wasn't scared to try something would generally wait until it no longer mattered whether he tried it at all. Cody did not say much in response, but he asked, a few weeks later, whether his grandfather would teach him how to figure a break-even the way he had for the goats, on something Cody might want to run on his own someday. Walter said he would, and that the arithmetic was the easy part. The hard part was being willing to look at a ruined field and ask it a different question than the one everyone else had already decided was the only one worth asking. Dale Furman came by in October, after the wheat had been drilled back into the north field and the goats were long gone, and the fence along the creek had been pulled back to a single strand for the winter. He stopped his truck at the edge of the field and looked out at the neat rows of new wheat coming up green in the fall light, nothing left to show that 16 goats had spent most of a summer month working that same ground. "You still keeping goats?" Dale asked when Walter came out to the fence to talk to him. "Not right now," Walter said. 16 was enough for what I needed. My boy's been asking about starting a few head himself, out on that rough ground behind the barn we've never done anything with. Wanted to know if it was worth the trouble. Depends what you're asking the ground to do," Walter said. "If you're asking it to be a wheat field, it isn't one. If you're asking it to grow something a man can sell, it might surprise you." Dale looked out at the wheat a while longer, then nodded and drove on toward his own place. The county had been right that the wheat crop was gone. The hail had left nothing to argue about there. Walter had not disagreed with that assessment and had not tried to save the crop, because there had been no crop left to save. What he had done instead was ask a different question of the same 30 acres, in the same 31 days the bank had given him, regardless of what the sky had done to his wheat. The field could not grow grain that month. It could still grow something. It had held straw and clover and shade and water, and it had held 16 animals that turned all of that into a stamped payment at Farmers and Merchants Bank before the insurance check ever arrived. The wheat would come up again next summer the way it always had. It would not remember the goats. The bank's ledger would. Walter thought about that distinction often in the months afterward, turning it over the way he turned over most things that had worked out, trying to understand exactly which part of it had mattered most. It was not the goats themselves, he decided eventually, and it was not the particular buyers he had found or the particular numbers he had landed on, because another year on another field with a different storm at a different time of the summer. None of those specifics might apply at all. What had mattered was that he had gone out to a field everyone else had already priced at zero and asked what it could still do rather than what it could no longer do, and had been willing to spend a week finding out the answer instead of a week waiting on an insurance check that was never going to arrive before the bank did. A field that failed at one thing had not necessarily failed at everything, and a man with 31 days and a note coming due did not always have the luxury of only asking the question the field was used to being asked. Would you have looked at that hailed-out wheat and called it a total loss, or gone looking for what else 30 acres of wrecked ground could still be worth in a month? The field didn't pay like wheat. It paid like time, borrowed against a crop that hadn't finished growing yet, and that was enough to get the note stamped before the check ever came.